Call my number, call my name. If you wander back again, call my number, call my name. We both know I'm to blame. Call my number, call my name. If you wander back again, call my number, call my name. We both know I'm to blame. We both know I'm to blame.
Alrighty. Well, today on our podcast, a special treat, a different format. Not just me and my preaching, but we have a guest with us that I am going to interview. The guest is AJ Swoboda. And AJ, pastor, theologian, author, professor, and a friend of mine that I feel really privileged to have on our podcast today. And we're going to talk about his most recent book, which I think is profound, helpful, and encouraging, and prescient to this particular moment that we find ourselves in. And so, welcome, AJ. Glad that we get to talk.
Friend, pastor, brother, comrade, Isaac Kovit, it's a delight to be with you.
So good. Well, the book is called After Doubt. It is deconstruction to reconstruction. It is written real time, and it is written with a wealth of information, perspective, sources from the past and the present that really help all of us to think through this journey of doubt and faith and how to make sense of it. And so excited to talk about it with you, AJ. How does it feel to have this book written?
Yeah, it's only been out we're recording this on, March 10th. It actually came out last Tuesday. The reception, is always varied for any book that you write. But I will say it feels terrific to have, but to birth this child. I don't know if the metaphor birth is appropriate for man, but it feels like it's the closest thing to birthing a child I'll ever do. And it's great to have the process done. But at the same time, I've never written anything that has been as much of an emotional journey as this book has, just given the sort of timely nature of the conversation.
Yeah, it's definitely, as I said, it's real time. It is talking about stuff that people right in the middle, and you can't help but be thrust into your own journey as you read the book. Yeah. Yep. Well, this Preston Sprinkle, a recent interview, theologian, scholar that is helpful to a lot of us. You were being interviewed on his podcast, and he called you the Hemingway of Christian writers. That was it.
I said to him, I said, man, you need to do more reading, bro. You need to read a lot more people.
So I just wanted to vamp on this for a minute. Hemingway said that every day he would start by reading, if whatever book he was working on, he would read all that he had written up to that point, and then he would start writing, which I thought was fascinating. As you get to the end of, a novel, that's quite a bit of reading, and then, to pick up writing. I'm curious about your writing habits. What is something about your write? How do you write? How do you get this stuff out?
Yeah, wow. There's a lot to say there. I have learned a lot about myself, and every writer is different. No writer writes the same. There's this great little book that I have called The Daily Habits of Writers by a guy last name Curry, and he talks about all the funky habits that writers have had over history. I was actually reading at one point about this one particular author who wrote horror stories, and she would actually sleep in a coffin at night to wake up in the morning and kind of creep herself out. I don't sleep in a coffin, but there are some things I've learned about myself. I've learned, for example, that when I have an epiphany or a moment of clarity, I have to stop what I'm doing and write at the moment. So I write kind of, on the spot. I do a lot of writing, sort of, because epiphanies don't ever schedule their appointments. They just happen usually. Another thing I've noticed about myself is I'm not very good at writing after lunch. So I don't usually write after noon. I write in the morning. That's my best time. And then thirdly is I do my best thinking. Oddly enough, it is the weirdest thing. I do my best thinking when I'm listening to other people lecture, talk, or preach. So there's just something about the process of listening to others that causes me to reflect and think deeper. So I do some of my best thinking as I'm going to church, as I'm sitting in church and processing what some of the clearest epiphanies I had for this book actually were sitting in the back row at my church and just taking notes and listening.
Wow. That's fun. That is fun. Okay. So AJ, why did you write this book of all things to birth? And it is powerful and it's helpful, but what was it that stirred you says, this is the book that I want to write?
Yeah, there's always a lot of reasons that people write books. When I wrote my book on the Sabbath, Subversive Sabbath, that came out of a very clear story of attempting to help our church rest and how difficult that was in a particular story. This one is a bit more cumulative in the sense that for the last 20 years, I have served in general the spiritual journeys of younger people. For 10 years, I was a college pastor at the University of Oregon. For 10 years, I was the church planter, pastor and missionary in Portland, where I pastored a church called Theophilus that we had planted. And the last few years, being a full-time academic teaching undergraduate students. And when you spend that much time sitting in the front row and watching the faith journeys and theological journeys and stories of people who are in the midst of what we call deconstruction and doubt, you learn a lot. In a real sense, in a real way, I've learned that most doubt and deconstruction stories are not actually all that unique. That is that there is a lot of similarities that they often share that I've had the opportunity to just watch from the front row and see. I think that coupled with my own deconstruction story of going to seminary, some things that happened there, really led me to believe that we very quickly need to begin to recognize and establish doubt and deconstruction as legitimate places that people can encounter the living God. But for too many of us, that has become a territory or a land that is almost like Siberia. It's like God isn't there. And really what this book is about is I'm inviting us to consider doubt and deconstruction as legitimate places that God wants to meet us. And I'm not talking about a new God. I'm not talking about a new God that is, our own creation. I think the Jesus of Nazareth that lived, died, and resurrected, the historic Jesus, if he can save us from our sin, he can save us in our doubt.
Well, we're using this word deconstruction in brief for somebody that might be listening and can kind of grasp what it is, but when it comes to faith, can you describe what deconstruction is?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the sort of philosophical and cultural answer to that, which is the kind of history, but the other is a very practical side. So let me give kind of the history side of it. The language of deconstruction is largely borrowed, at least in this context, it's largely borrowed from a certain community of French philosophers, Michel Foucault, individuals from a very certain period of time that you and I would call sort of the postmodern thinkers. One of the marks of postmodernism was a critique of historic understandings of truth and religion. And so deconstruction in that context is a dismantling of traditional religious understandings or philosophical understandings. So it is in essence philosophical. It is to pull apart something that we used to believe, to pull apart a set of beliefs. But that's kind of a very brief and I would say unfairly caricatured depiction. There's a lot to say about that, and I unpack that in the book. There's what we're really interested here is in the practical side, and this is what the practical side is. This is our son or our daughter or that kid in the youth group who loves Jesus and goes to college, and in 1 year comes back and says, "I don't think I'm a Christian anymore," and posts a Facebook note on their social media page or Instagram or TalkTalk saying, "I'm done, and I reject kind of my upbringing and who I am." It is an inherent undoing of what one has received. And we are this on a practical side. This is something that is impacting every single person in our lives. This is not philosophically, it's not interesting because it's got a philosophical history. It's interesting because these are our sons, our daughters, and our friends. And in some cases, us. So that's what construction is.
Thank you for helping it to connect. And for those who are listening are probably part of the New Hope body, and we regularly pray that those who are struggling, and there's a whole tide and a whole culture and a whole stew of our society that is pressing people towards those kinds of moments. And you do a great job of helping us to see some of that.
And can I actually add something to that? It is a tendency in circles that you and I swim in. It is a tendency to see deconstruction as entirely bad. One of the things that I tried to do in my book is help capture the idea that actually there are some really good things about deconstruction. For example, we have to recognize that Jesus deconstructed. When you read Matthew 5-7, Jesus, every time Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard it said, but I say to you," he is deconstructing religious interpretations that were wrong. Martin Luther deconstructed Catholicism, and we have a movement based on deconstruction called Protestantism, of which you and I are a part of. There are many, many examples of deconstruction being really positive and necessary. And for a lot of people that I'm encountering now, they are not deconstructing because they don't like Christ anymore. They are deconstructing because they're fed up with Christians. And I'm experiencing more and more and more people who are deconstructing, not because they reject Jesus, but because they can't stand for a church that they see as propping up a lot of really not good things.
And so that would be the healthy side. And you do help in the book for us to wrestle with that. You say one of your great phrases, which, by the way, of like one-liners, you just have such a great way of making a sentence say so much. You say, "Not every storm is a shipwreck." Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah, and I'm borrowing the language of Paul there, who's talking about these two characters, Hymenaeus and Alexander, who he says have abandoned their faith. They've shipwrecked their faith. When Paul writes about Hymenaeus and is talking about this person who has shipwrecked his faith, he is writing to a church in the midst of a storm. Storms were very common for the early Christians. They were in the midst of internal storms, external storms. They were being persecuted, all sorts of things. And Paul, we know about Paul. He actually got shipwrecked at one point. So he knows what a shipwreck is. And that's pretty clear language for somebody who had been in a shipwreck. For Paul, he does not equate storms with shipwrecks. There is a difference. There is a difference between wrestling with your faith, struggling to believe, wrestling with your doubts and abandoning your faith.
Yeah.
Those are two different things. And you know where we see that? We see that in the fact that the New Testament gives us the story of Peter and the story of Judas, two disciples of Jesus, who have one thing in common. Both of them turned their back on Jesus. The difference between the two is one of them came back. Even the New Testament distinguishes between a Peter and a Judas. We are all going to have moments when we turn our back on Jesus. The difference is, are we willing to stick around long enough to be reconciled and made right to the living God? And what I'm seeing, as you are seeing, is the dark side of deconstruction. A lot of individuals who are not sticking around and calling it quits. And that is what we would call bad deconstruction. A very, very dark and insidious version of it.
Yeah. Yes. So, and for those who are listening, this book gives such a great encouragement for those who might be watching the storms of those that they love, but also caution that does not have to mean shipwreck, and probably that informs some of our responsiveness to those things. Great encouragement. And anecdotally, I'm seeing that we have young people that are willing to work through and stick through and embrace the community of a local church and find better footing on the other side, which is hugely encouraging.
Yes. Yeah. You hit you kind of touch on a pretty sensitive tension point here, or funny bone on this conversation. And that is the relationship between doubt and community, because how do we make space for people to wrestle with their faith in a faithful Christian community?
Yeah.
I'm reminded in John chapter 20, that a story that helps us see how the early church did this. Thomas is struggling to believe the resurrection. Jesus has resurrected. 10 of the disciples have seen the resurrection, but Thomas doesn't believe. And he says, if I can see his scars, if I can touch his scars, then I'll believe. And there's a brief line you have to pay very close attention to. The disciples tell him, in the resurrection, he doesn't believe. And then it says, a week later, Jesus showed up to show him his body. Now, it's striking to me two things. It's striking to me that Jesus does not rush in to solve his doubt crisis immediately. Does not rush in. He actually allows him to struggle. And I tend to be of the persuasion that Jesus really knew what he was doing, that he was not only the Son of God, but the perfect Son of God, and knew what he was doing. And that his waiting a week was very intentional. He could have dropped everything to go talk to Thomas, but he doesn't. There's a line in Dallas Willard's book where he says, sometimes from time to time, God lets us stew in our doubts. And I see that happening right there. The second thing that strikes me is that Thomas is in the community for a week before he sees the resurrected Jesus. And what's striking me about that is that the disciples who had seen the resurrection made space for a guy in doubt in their midst. Now, when we read Jude verse 22, that says, be merciful to those who doubt, it implies that we have doubters in our midst. I think as a community, we have a responsibility to create generative space for people wrestling with their faith to be in our midst. And not isolate, marginalize, shut them up, but to allow their questions to be welcomed and actually allow their questions to teach us something.
That's beautiful. That is aspirational. That's exciting to think about. And my prayer, and a question that I'll get to later, is your perspective for pastors coming out of this, beyond reading the book, which is helpful, but we'll get to that. As I'm reading the book, and so much of it, I'm just like, yes, thank you for putting language to stuff that I felt or put partial language to it at different times, because you do a great job of helping us understand the landscape of our culture that is really does curate deconstruction, and it doesn't curate construction. It doesn't necessarily leave us, if we're not thoughtful about it or aware of it, with a sense that any belief can be something that can really be built and built upon. So one of the dynamics that I've touched on before, and I think you do a great job, is that we don't understand kings. And so when we say something like Jesus is Lord, and you get into this, that, you know, we threw off the tyranny of King George as Americans.
Yeah.
And that has totally informed how we think about authority. Yeah. And we don't even know how much, you know, we do. We you know, those who we elect serve us. Yeah. That is the general. Yeah. So I'd love for you to vamp on that a little bit. How does this undermine our discipleship? And
yes. Yeah, great question. And in chapter 3, which I'm very convinced, based on early 1 week, if there's a chapter that's going to get me killed, it's chapter 3, which is entitled "The Problem of Freedom." The premise of this chapter is that, in particular, in American culture, and I'm talking about American culture, not all of Western culture, American culture, there is this sense of identity that is drawn from our earliest formation as a nation, and that is that we are formed. Our identity is formed around who we are against. We were formed as a rejection of the British monarchy. That was our earliest formation identity. Was as a rejection of authority, and I'm highly convinced that. And I borrow on a litany of authors, one being a guy named William Hooper, was actually a very good friend of C.S. Lewis. In a foreword to one of his books, says, he makes a comment. He says, people that are shaped by the ideal of personal freedom and autonomy are most tempted to freely choose their own image of God. And his point is that people like ourselves who are formed in an identity around rejection of authority will tend at some point to do that to God. And so what we end up doing is, rather than seeking to love the God who is, we will love the God that we want. And you hear this all the time. The number of times in my classroom, I have had a student say, I could never serve a God who, and then fill in the blank.
Yeah.
I could never serve a God who who thinks that way about sexuality or created hell or thinks What we're really saying there is that we're more generous than Jesus.
Yeah.
What we're really saying is that we are greater than God. And the Bible has a word for that. It's called idolatry. We are worshiping our own ideals over the real God. And the dark side of deconstruction is that rather than being made in the image of God, we start making God in our own image. And God exists as a way of backing up what we think. And I'm going to be clear here, and this may, you've invited me to come and preach in a little while. This may get me uninvited. But this is a problem on the right and the left. It's a problem on the left because, for example, around the sexuality conversation, we love Jesus. We love, the progressive loves Jesus, loves the resurrection. But all that stuff about sexual holiness, we're done with that. But the right, man, we love the lives of the unborn, and we will fight for them until the day we die. But the minute we talk about children who are refugees, or the minute we talk about immigrants, it's as though we're not pro-life anymore. And here's what I'm trying to say. We are all selective about the parts of the kingdom of God that fit our agendas. Yeah. And it's a very dangerous place to be. We are called to embrace all of God, not just the parts we like.
Yeah. Yes. And I don't know that we can, this aspect of your book and the concern with the idolatry of freedom, essentially.
Yes.
In which we automatically have to dismiss or remove the freedom of God, that he is autonomous and free to act as he will and has revealed himself in his wisdom, and that is infinite and needs to be respected. But within our culture, in which we have, it's so easy to reject that. We throw off that reality, and even like our election cycle curates within us an endurance for the things that we don't like, knowing that soon we will have ours and we will vote again, throw out of office. And so it keeps us in a very skeptical and cynical kind of framework relative to authority, tradition, things passed down, and it can be the left or the right, as you're saying.
The sovereignty of God has no electoral college.
Yeah.
We can have all the opinions we want, but our feelings about God don't change who God is.
Mm-hmm.
But we think they do, because we're Americans who have been like, well, we're done with you, King George. And we think sort of our opinions. I had this experience a few weeks ago. I had a student in my office here for office hours, and we were talking about sexuality, for example, because that's everybody's talking about this right now, and it's a very important conversation. And I'm very conservative on sexuality, and I'm not ashamed to have this discussion. And it seems like there's no political agenda. Okay, we're all over the place. Okay, but I'm oddly conservative, and I'm having this conversation with her about sexuality, and she says, I ask her, well, what do you think about sexuality? And she says, well, I think God has evolved. I think God has changed. And I said, well, what has God changed from? And she says, well, when you read the Bible, God has a very clear sort of set of ideas, and I see that. But I think God has evolved and is more open-minded now. And I said, I sort of blurted this out without even recognizing that these words were going to come out of my mouth. I said, wait a second. Are we talking about God or you? And as the words came out, I knew exactly what they meant.
Yeah.
She wasn't describing God. She was describing herself, and she needed God to fit what she thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not poking fun of my student. We all do that.
Right. Yeah.
We all do that to God. We are just so selective about the God that we want, you know? And my question is, at what point did we buy into the idea that we thought our opinions actually mattered?
Mm-hmm.
God was like, well, you think that way now. Well, maybe I should sort of rethink my eternal nature to fit your feelings.
On an aside, and I might edit this out, but Audrey Assad, are you familiar with Audrey Assad? She's a Christian musician, and she tends more to the progressive side, but she put a Facebook post out today of like losing my, or disbelieving in hell. And like, it's basically her journey of, I've always felt that God couldn't be this way, and now I'm courageous enough to say that God isn't that way, regarding hell. And, it's a big question. But I just think, oh man, I don't know, what is it about these like social media coming out parties for people of influence to say, guys, by the way, I have come to this realization, and there's not even one mention of scripture or church or authority or tradition or.
I hope you don't edit out what you just said. I think there is a really big problem in Protestant culture. And here's one of the problems in Protestant culture. Protestant culture does not do sainthood. Or I should say, let me clarify.
So good.
So we do sainthood. Okay, so the way we do sainthood versus the way Catholics do sainthood is that for Catholics, there are two requirements. You have to be dead and you have to have performed a miracle. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Protestants do sainthood. It just is, how big is your audience? It's your platform.
Yeah.
And that is a very, very big problem, because humans now, living humans, are our saints. And we are now living at the whim of our celebrity theologies.
Yeah.
I don't think the living can handle sainthood. I don't think the living can handle it. Right. I only think the only people who can handle sainthood are dead humans. Because we are so fickle and change all the time And I'm on him too. When we look at what's happened to Ravi Zacharias, he was a saint.
Yeah.
This is what happens when we
Right.
too early sainthood people.
Yeah. Oh, I'm totally with you. I heard Michael Horton, Greek Orthodox guy, talking about the legitimacy of sainthood a couple years ago, and it totally helped me, because we do need people that we look to and heroes and to model. But man, let people die first and then have their life evaluated.
Yes.
Before we
years to think about what they've said and make sure that we've looked at their text messages and looked at all the stuff that they've done to ensure that these are people we should look up to. And until we fix this, we are going to have celebrity after celebrity fall, and it is just going to create more and more and more and more resentment and anger. I am not a Catholic. There are reasons I am not a Catholic.
Yeah.
But I have come to a place in my understanding of the church to recognize that when you've had 2,000 years to think about some stuff, you've got some pretty good ideas. And I think Protestants need to learn to humble themselves and at least be willing to sit and listen to the tradition that has come before us. Does not mean we agree, but we have the humility to learn some things.
Yeah. Yeah. Wasn't it Lewis who said, if read new books and old books, but if you have to choose, read old books that have been stood the test of time beyond peer review. So people should read your book too, AJ.
Yeah, I am saying this now, and I'm like trying to get people to read a book that I wrote. Yeah, isn't that ironic? It's so funny. So funny. Lord have mercy. Well, if you read my book, you're going to find that I lean very heavily on returning to the dead, going to the dead. And it is a major theme in the book. And man, when we begin to read dead Christians are the best.
Yep.
They're the best. They are just the best.
Yeah, and I think a part of what your book is doing is dragging these dead people into our awareness and helping. We are seeing how their words and their constructs of thinking and how they have processed is helpful for the hubris of today, the chaos and the carnage that we are seeing all around us. So thank you for doing that. So there's so much, AJ, in this book, and I just want to be clear as we wrap up that I look forward to people reading it and engaging with it. You are going to be at New Hope at the beginning of May 2nd, I think, is what we decided on. Yeah, and we'll make books available to purchase there and all the stuff. We want people to read the book because I think it is very helpful. So somebody that's listening right now, and they are in a process of doubt, or somebody that is close to them, and those are two separate questions, but what would be, beyond reading the book, which again is helpful, what would be a couple of pieces of advice that you would give to the person that is in a dense season of doubt right now?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And my hope is that there is someone listening to this that is asking that question. I'd say two things. I'd say two things. The first is, in the midst of your doubt, your deconstruction, you're wrestling with the faith. I would say, don't replace the church with a podcast. Get yourself into a community of people that's going to point you to Jesus, even in the midst of your doubt. And don't replace flesh and blood on the ground with a talk.
Yeah.
Don't replace your pastor with somebody who's not going to be there for you when you die. Get back to the flesh and the blood. Don't let the virtual reality be the space where you do the primary wrestling. Get around some people.
Yeah.
I'd say the second thing is, if you ever prayed the sinner's prayer, start praying the doubter's prayer. And it actually turns out the sinner's prayer isn't in the Bible, but the doubter's prayer is. And it's that prayer of the man who was struggling because his daughter had died. Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. It's the doubter's prayer. And the doubter's prayer is beautiful because it recognizes the complexity of where you're at. I do believe, God, but please help me in my unbelief. and it gives God a foothold to hear your desire. And only pray it if you mean it. Don't pray it if you don't mean it. Don't pray it just to pray it. If you really are struggling with doubt and you really want to love God, tell God that. Yeah. We have a word for this. It's called confession, and confession is telling God what is true.
Yes. Thank you. That is tweetable. Don't replace the one that is going to be with you when you die or alongside you when you're sick with somebody that can give a fancy talk far away from somewhere. Yeah. And that is, man, there's a lot to that. I'd love to unpack that with you post-pandemic, how the church comes out of this. We got to, I think, embodied communities, and virtual communities are not embodied communities. And as much as I love you and I'm sitting with you right now, I think if I was next to you, I would sense the Holy Spirit more deeply than what we can over a two-dimensional screen.
Yes. Yep. I'd hug you and embrace you. And I'm so excited to be with you in a short time. It's going to be really fun to be together.
Yeah. Well, finally, just you have like 3 minutes for pastors, whether that's Isaac or others. What is your advice for people that are struggling?
I would say practice when you are sitting with someone who is talking about vulnerably coming out about their doubt and what they're walking through in their faith journey, and they are walking you through the terrain of their struggles. Do not, when they're finished, do not launch into advice mode. Listen and value, recognize, acknowledge, and normalize the experience of the person who's in front of you. And before you offer any of your brilliant advice, simply say this: do you need me to listen today, or do you want me to share? Practice what I call spiritual consent. If you are not given permission to speak, then don't speak. So when you are given permission to speak, speak. But until you are, honor the person's story before barging in. Can I tell a story and then I'll be done?
Yeah.
I mean, this is in the book, but at some point, I was told a story about this young woman passed along a story to me, who was raised in a kind of conservative Christian home, and she said, one of the marks of her home was there were never any boundaries, and the mark that there were never boundaries is her mom would always just barge into her room without knocking. So her mom would just barge in. She'd never knock. She would just barge into her room whenever, up until she was 18 years old. There were no boundaries. And she goes off to university, and her first year of university deconstructs her entire faith. After college, she gets married and has a kid and really needs God again. So she starts going back to church, because that's what happens when you have a kid, is you need God again. And she starts going back to church, and she reads the book of Revelation. And she reads the line where Jesus says, "I stand at the door and knock." And for the very first time, she understood that Jesus does not coerce and barge in, he invites. In the words of my friend Mandy Smith, we cannot do the kingdom in empire ways. To barge our way in, to force our way in, is to do more than Jesus did. We must knock. We must.
Wow. Whew. That's good. That's good pastoral advice. Yeah, and hopeful. Well, AJ, we look forward to having you with us at New Hope, and in person. We look forward to helping you get this book out, not for the sake of you getting a book out, but because God has shaped you and your mind your experience in a way that is helpful for this generation right now. And glad that we're just up the road from you, and glad to be your friend. And I pray for you, and I'll continue to pray for you that your voice with students, churches, the broader world would continue to be used for God's glory. So thank you for.
And you, Isaac, are a phenomenal, gifted, compassionate shepherd who is a gift to everyone he comes in contact with. Thank you for who you are.
Blessings on you, AJ. Have a great rest of your day. Tell that student of yours, Samantha May, who I'm doing premarital counseling. Yeah, tell her she loves your Hebrews class. She's told me about it. So tell her I say hello.
Oh boy. Done. I'll see her in 5 minutes. How fun.
That's great.
I love you.
All right, man.
Thank you for making space for me.
You bet. Thank you.
I love you. Okay. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.
Call my number, call my name. If you wander back again, call my number, call my name. We both know